Today's story starts with a press conference.
I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The year is 1971. Richard Nixon is president. He makes a decision that would alter society for the next 50 years.
In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
You're probably thinking, 1971, what war were we about to enter? That's what he's referring to, right? An all-out offensive is only used when troops invade enemy territory, I thought.
I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
Nixon's wording makes it sound like America was about to participate in another D-Day invasion. Nixon wanted to put an end to the drug use that was sweeping through America's youth.
This will be a worldwide offensive, dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world.
This would make for a perfect cutscene in a movie where Americans are fighting an alien invasion. The aliens only want the Americans, so wherever you are in the world, my dear Americans, Congress will now be funded to protect you. The alien was drugs, and they are evil, kids. We will drug you up if you go to the doctor, but if we find out that you're using them outside of the doctor's office, that's jail time. Today's story begins with the war on drugs because you'll see how this leads to profits today for a couple of America's largest investment funds.
The privatization of prisons and detention centers has been a source of debate for over 3 decades.
There has to be some things in our society that we agree are not a business opportunity.
This video is discussing private prisons that profit from incarcerating Americans. On the surface, the idea of allowing private companies to better allocate taxpayer dollars should be celebrated. Fewer taxpayer dollars that go toward prisons means more taxpayer dollars can go towards ads showing your kids that smoking weed will lead to them playing video games their entire life.
The U.S. privatized parts of its state and federal corrections and detention facilities in the 1980s.
In the eyes of the government, drugs were becoming a major problem that needed to be solved. During the 1980s, the United States of America entered a war it still has not won. But the prison population truly exploded during President Ronald Reagan's administration. When Reagan took office in 1980, the total prison population was 329,000, and when he left office 8 years later, the prison population had essentially doubled to 627,000. This sounds like a potential business opportunity. Demand doubled in 8 years. The government is signing the checks. Could prisons become privatized and for profit? 1984, the Corrections Corporation of America, now Corecivic, opens the world's first private prison, a federal immigrant detention center in Houston, Texas. You're probably confused as to how a detention center or a prison can be private, meaning a private company owns and operates the facilities while making a profit. Yes, you're thinking correctly. The more inmates, the higher the profit.
This construction site in Houston, Texas will soon become the first completely free enterprise prison in the United States. It is being built to detain up to 300 aliens charged with entering this country illegally and awaiting deportation hearings.
A public prison is one that is completely owned by the government. This means that they have to provide the prison building, staff the guards and administration, and oversee all of the incarcerated individuals and everything that happens inside the prison. Even with a public prison, some of the services are outsourced to private contractors such as the food service, cleaning service, and maintenance. I think we can all agree that taxpayer dollars should go towards prisons as they serve a public utility. When people break the law, they are sent away in adult timeout. Prisons keep us safe, except on the purge day every year. With a private prison, many of the burdens are taken off the government and put onto a private company. Instead of all the business that goes along with running a prison, the government is responsible for sentencing, classifying, and assigning inmates to a prison and providing oversight. Now that begs the question of how a for-profit prison makes money. If you're like me, you immediately see this as a conflict of interest. A company is running prisons and obviously financially motivated to keep the prisons full.
From 1980 to 1994, operating costs of state and federal prisons went from $3 million to nearly $18 million. Overcrowding was becoming increasingly problematic, and the government couldn't keep up. Private prisons were established to help maintain the $10 billion industry.
Why were the costs of operating prisons rising? Because incarcerating Americans became the cool thing to do under the Reagan administration. Look at this graph showing the prison system growth from 1950 to 2016. For the first 25 years of the chart, 1950 to 1975, Americans were behaving steadily. Then starting around the war on drugs era, apparently Americans just couldn't stop committing crimes. Or maybe laws were enacted to turn citizens into criminals. On the surface, a private prison seems like a great idea. If it costs the government $200 per day to incarcerate someone, and a private company comes along and says they can do it for $150 per day, then why not save the government money while allowing a corporation to profit? The problem lies in the economics behind prisoners.
Two companies in particular, Corecivic and GEO Group, have dominated the industry.
Good morning, Corrections Corporation of America.
And a new company, the Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, now called Corecivic, offered an alternative.
At CCA, we have an answer to your problems.
We intend to be the IBM, if you will, of the corrections business.
Corecivic, formerly Corrections Corporation of America, the second largest private prison company in America, is owned by, do you know? It's a publicly traded company, so we can find out. BlackRock fund advisors hold more than 15% of the shares of the company. The Vanguard Group holds more than 10%. The combined equity between the two funds and Corecivic is over $300 million. That kind of revenue requires a lot of nonviolent charges to be prosecuted. GEO Group has more customers than Corecivic, inmates, and are also owned by BlackRock and Vanguard Group. What is the primary responsibility of a publicly traded company? To earn profit and make money for its shareholders. Private prisons run by these large companies have profit on their mind, not low occupancy in their prisons. If the goal of a prison is to allow a guilty party to serve their sentence and return back to society a changed man ready to contribute, then are we sure that a company needing prisoners has the same goals? One of the goals of the prison system is to rehabilitate people. Based on a U.S. Department of Justice study in which data from 30 states measured state recidivism rates from 2005 through 2014, the recidivism rate was 83%, possibly putting that goal in doubt. Besides that point, if prison was 100% effective, the private prisons would be working themselves out of business. This makes one wonder, is prison supposed to rehabilitate the individual, or is it supposed to earn money? If the goal is to earn money, then a higher prison population is the end goal. Why did I start this video with Richard Nixon? Because the war on drugs has sent hundreds of thousands of Americans to the joint for crimes as non-violent as Jake Paul's boxing opponents. What I'm showing you now is a letter written by Corecivic to 48 states providing their demands in order to take over a prison from the government. A minimum of 1,000 beds, structure age of no more than 25 years. Okay, sounds reasonable so far. Structure that is suitable for immediate occupation. Okay, that makes sense. An assurance by the agency partner that the agency has sufficient inmate population to maintain a minimum 90% occupancy rate over the term of the contract. And here's where the conflict of interest rears its ugly head. A minimum of 90% occupancy means they need those prisons full. They don't want good behavior. If the prisons need to be full and citizens aren't committing crimes, then how are they going to fill the prisons? I have just the solution. The war on drugs significantly increased the prison population. Since President Reagan institutionalized the war on drugs in 1981, incarceration rates had almost tripled by 2017. In May 2021, the Federal Bureau of Prisons listed 46.3% of federal inmates as incarcerated because of drug convictions.
Today we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them.
This is Corecivic's financial statements. They had revenues of over $1.9 billion in 2020, with $500 million being gross profit. There's two ways to improve a business. Either increase the revenue and or decrease expenses. If you're in the prison business, how do you think they do it? More inmates and reduced operating expenses sound like the only solution to me.
Something that is really key to understanding about private prisons is that they're actually structured as something called real estate investment trusts, or REITs, R-E-I-T-S. The interesting thing about this structure is that it actually allows these two companies to largely avoid paying income taxes.
Here's Corecivic's Yahoo Finance profile, and sure enough, they are a REIT. What she goes on to say is that because they operate as a REIT, they pass on 90% of their income to shareholders and rely on big banks for loans. Wall Street banks currently have credit arrangements of $2.692 billion with Corecivic and GEO Group. This figure includes $1.7 billion in lines of credit and $992 million in term loans. Through these agreements, the companies regularly tap the banks as sources of credit to support their operations and expansion. They were getting their wallets full funding these companies, but that cash flow generator might be drying up now that public unrest is getting louder. GEO Group running out of banks as 100% of known banking partners say no to the private prison sector. Major private prison firms Corecivic and GEO Group stand to lose 72%, about $1.9 billion, of their private financing as major banks commit to divesting from the private prison industry under pressure from activists, according to a new analysis by the Center for Popular Democracy and other groups. What's interesting is that big banks began pulling out of their financing obligations to these two large players in the private prison sector. Because these companies rely so much on financing, they may have a tough road ahead if they're unable to receive funding. Even with that FUD news, private prisons seem to have found a goldmine of profit potential. Immigrant detention is now the fastest growing form of incarceration in the United States, an increasingly lucrative business that costs taxpayers $2 billion per year. Its roots reach back to the early 1980s with then President Ronald Reagan's war on drugs and tough on crime laws. Now we can start seeing how government intervention began causing mayhem for a certain group of people in America. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum prison sentences for certain drug offenses. This law was later heavily criticized as having racist ramifications because it allocated longer prison sentences for offenses involving the same amount of crack cocaine, used more often by black Americans, as powder cocaine, used more often by white Americans. 5 grams of crack triggered an automatic 5-year sentence, while it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to merit the same sentence. I didn't seem to learn about that fact in my social studies class in high school. We were too busy being taught about Pocahontas and John Smith, because that is way more relevant to my understanding of American history than the laws that led to a certain group of people being incarcerated at a far higher rate than another. Private companies house about 9% of the nation's total prison population, but they take care of a much higher share of immigrant detainees, 73% by some accounts. I shared earlier that these for-profit prison companies are generating billions of dollars each year in revenue and only make up about 9% of the total prison population. Like any other large corporation, they will look for other revenue streams. To me, none of these numbers matter at all if the prisons are well run. They operate in such a way that taxpayer money is put to better use elsewhere, and they focus on training their inmates to become upstanding citizens upon leaving prison. But they have shareholders, income statements, balance sheets, and a need to show profit each quarter. Thankfully, the banks are no longer financing these companies, because when they were, you could argue that all of the behemoth corporations were profiting off of incarcerating nonviolent citizens. They were all incentivized to fill the prisons. Why do you think our prisons are so full? The presidency of Ronald Reagan marked the start of a long period of skyrocketing rates of incarceration, largely thanks to his unprecedented expansion of the drug war. The number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug law offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. The powers that be control the entire system that we operate within. This quote was probably the most mind-blowing during my research for this topic. This is John Ehrlichman, a top Nixon aide, speaking in a 1994 interview. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This is another story that I don't think made it into my history books in high school, but seems kind of important to our society today. Assuming John didn't have ulterior motives and is speaking truth, if this is what our presidents can do, imagine what else they've done that we haven't heard about. Now that we've reached the end of the video, it's time to put on some conspiracy theory music and have a little fun. This is just some internet blog research, so take it all with a grain of salt, but it does make you think. Viacom, AT&T, which bought Time Warner, Warner Music Group, Fox, Disney. You'll see one name as a top shareholder in all of these companies, Vanguard and or BlackRock. For the sake of time, I'll keep this short. The same investment funds that are the largest owners in the biggest media companies are also the largest shareholders in the private prison communities. You'll see one name as a top shareholder in all of these companies, Vanguard and or BlackRock. For the sake of time, I'll keep this short. The same investment funds that are the largest owners in the biggest media companies are also the largest shareholders in the private prison companies. These investment funds profit from you consuming their media, and then they profit when people go to jail. I'm a big fan of rap and hip hop from previous decades, but it does make you wonder why the music being heavily promoted by these companies involves a lot of violence, drug use, and use of weapons. I personally don't think this is the case, but it makes for interesting chatter on internet forums. If you like conspiracy theories, that's a rabbit hole that will fill your time. Is there some truth to it? Up to you to decide. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching.